The integration monitoring record for Accord Station Varath's Vihari research cohort was a document that Kale Marin maintained with the thorough, accurate quality of someone who had been doing integration work for 7 years and who had, in 7 years, developed the understanding that the monitoring record was not the integration work. It was the documentation of the integration work, which was a distinction that mattered because the integration work was what happened in the rooms and the corridors and the shared meals and the briefings, and the monitoring record was the account of what happened. And the account was only as useful as it was accurate, and the accuracy required the kind of honest attention that the integration work itself required. The record had 22 observations about Saris Veen. He had noticed this in the 3rd week and had assessed it with the professional honesty that 7 years of integration work had made automatic. The density was not produced by her being more professionally significant than the other cohort members. The density was produced by his attention. He had implemented the managed distance in the 4th weeks, beginning with the same methodical quality he brought to everything: the communal meal timing, the briefing room seating, the corridor routing that kept his path through the station's working day from overlapping with the paths that her research schedule produced. He had managed it well enough that the cohort did not notice, and the program's standard monitoring did not flag an anomaly, and his professional documentation continued to be accurate. He had not added to the 22 observations in 3 weeks. This was itself an inaccuracy, because the integration specialist's monitoring practice required accurate observation of all cohort members, and the observation of Saris Veen had not stopped. It had been redirected, managed. The direct attention replaced by the peripheral attention that accurate monitoring of a communal space produced as a baseline, which was not the same as the direct observation the record required, and which had produced, in 3 weeks, a gap in the notation column that was its own kind of finding. He was walking through the Level 3 corridor on the 6th week's 3rd day with the research briefing documentation, and the office 3 minutes away, and the gap in the notation column somewhere in his peripheral awareness, when she came out of the laboratory access. She had been crying. The Vihari ears were in the distress configuration, the specific downward angle at the tips that he had learned to read in his 1st year of integration work with the Vihari, and that he had been reading in cohort members for 6 weeks, and that he had not seen in her, specifically, until this moment. The eyes had the luminescence change. She had come out of the laboratory with the specific quality of someone who had been in the private space of their own emotion and had not expected to encounter anyone. She encountered him. He stopped. The 3 weeks of managed distance were in the corridor with them. He was aware of this. He stopped anyway because the distress markers were what they were, and because the 3 weeks of managed distance had not, in 3 weeks, stopped the 22 observations from being the most accurate documentation he had produced in 6 weeks, which was a finding about the distance's effectiveness that he was aware of and had been not addressing. "Are you all right?" he said. She looked at him. The assessment in her expression, the quality of someone determining how to answer a question that had 2 layers, lasted the specific moment that assessments lasted before they produced a decision. "No," she said. He looked at the empty corridor. He looked at his tablet. He looked at her with the full, direct quality of attention that the managed distance had been managing and that the corridor had made less available than the stopping. "Do you want to tell me what's happened?" She told him. He listened with the integration specialist's quality of attention, receiving the information completely before responding, following the structure of what was being described rather than formulating the response. The research finding, the asymmetry in the bioelectric interface data, the methodology's inability to address the asymmetry within the joint agreement's current structure. He heard the technical content, and he heard, underneath the technical content, the 6 hours alone in the laboratory with a significant finding and no second perspective, and the specific, compounding weight of holding a problem that had professional and political implications while holding it alone. "Come to my office," he said. "Tell me the specific asymmetry. I want to understand what you found before we talk about how to report it." She looked at him. The ears shifted, fractionally, in the specific way that the Vihari ears shifted when a person's situation had changed in a direction that offered something the distress configuration was the distress of not having. "You know research methodology," she said. "I know joint agreement structures," he said. "And I know what oversight committees respond to, and the difference between a methodology refinement and a primary objective failure is usually in the framing rather than the finding." He paused, There may be a framework for this that the Oversight Committee receives differently from how you've been reading it in the laboratory. She looked at him with the quality of someone who had been holding a finding alone for 6 hours, and who had just been offered the specific, practical thing that 6 hours of alone had not produced, which was a second perspective on the finding from outside the distress the finding had generated. "The office," she said. "Yes," he said. They walked. The 4 hours in the office produced what 4 hours of genuine collaborative work produced, which was the framework that one person working alone for 6 hours had not been able to build because the framework required more than one perspective, and the 6 hours had been one perspective in distress. He pulled the data. She walked him through the asymmetry with the precision of a researcher who had confirmed a finding 3 times, and whose description of the finding was accurate in the way that 3 confirmations produced. He listened with the integration specialist's quality of attention, following the structure, building the picture, and then he looked at the picture from the outside of the methodology. The asymmetry was real. The 3 confirmations were correct. But the asymmetry was not the failure mode that 6 hours of alone had produced in her reading of it. It was the failure mode of the methodology's environmental model, which had underestimated the bioelectric complexity of the station's mixed-species environment, which was itself a finding. The finding that the environment exceeded the model's predictions, which was data about the research environment that the joint agreement needed and could not have generated without encountering exactly the asymmetry. He built this framework for her across the 4 hours, not as reassurance, as the accurate alternative framework that the data supported when it was read from outside the distress the data had generated. She sat with each component as he built it. She asked the questions of someone checking the framework's load-bearing elements rather than accepting the framework because it was more comfortable than the one she had been using. She was a researcher. She checked the framework held. "The Oversight Committee," she said, "if it's framed as an environmental complexity finding." They received data that the joint agreement's primary objective needs and that the current methodology couldn't have generated without encountering the asymmetry, he said, which is a timeline revision and a methodology adjustment rather than a primary objective failure. She looked at the data, she looked at the framework, she looked at him. "Why didn't you come to the laboratory this morning?" she said. The question had the quality of the corridor's accurate answer. He recognized it, the question underneath the question that could have been asked, which would have been something about the report or the methodology or the committee, any of the professional register questions that the office's working space permitted. This was not that question. This was the one that was underneath. He looked at the display. He looked at the 2 chairs. "I have been managing distance," he said, "since the beginning of week 4. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "The meal timing," she said. "The briefing seating, the corridor routing." She described the pattern with the specific quality of someone who had observed a pattern and had confirmed the observation and had been waiting to name it to the person whose pattern it was. "I noticed in week 4, I confirmed it in week 5. "I didn't know you had noticed," he said. "I know," she said. "I did not know why." She looked at him steadily. "I know why now." He looked at the office's wall where the research was posted because it was useful. He looked at the notation column's entry gap. He looked at her. "The professional ethics," he said. "The integration specialist's framework. The relationship between the specialist and the cohort." "I read the framework document in week 2, she said. "The framework describes the complication. It does not describe the solution as distance." He was quiet for a moment that had the quality of someone receiving an accurate observation and sitting with its accuracy. She was right. The framework described the complication and the management principle. The specific mechanism was professional honesty, which was the integration specialist's foundational quality, and which the distance had been a version of not practicing. "The 22 observations," he said. She looked at him. "In the monitoring record, week 3, I assessed them and determined the density was not produced by professional significance." He looked at her. "It was produced by personal significance, which is the accurate description." She was quiet with this in the way of someone receiving an accurate description and sitting with it rather than managing their response to it. "The 3 weeks, she said. "The distance was not the right management." "No," he said, "it wasn't. The right management," she said, "is the disclosure." "Yes," he said, "which I am going to file today, after the report's 6th section." She looked at him. The ears were in the arriving position, the position of something that had been building and was arriving, and the luminescence had the quality that was not distress. "The report," she said. We should complete it. Yes, he said. They completed it. The 6 days of the report's writing were the 6 days of building something that required both of them. The research methodology's precision from her, and the committee framework's strategic understanding from him, and the specific negotiation between the two that produced documentation that was accurate and receivable simultaneously. He filed the disclosure on the 6th day. He wrote it with the honesty that the integration specialist's foundational quality required, not the honesty of performance, not the managed honesty of someone constructing a favorable presentation, but the accurate description of the situation that had been present since the 22 observations, and that the 3 weeks of distance had been the avoidance of describing. The disclosure said, personal significance had been present since week 3. The management implemented in weeks 4 and 5 had been avoidance rather than the program's required management, which was disclosure. The specialist's professional effectiveness had not been compromised. The report and the 6 days of collaborative work were the evidence of this. But the disclosure was necessary and was, in the 6th week, being provided. The oversight mechanism received it. The assessment took 2 days. He told her the assessment's outcome in the office on the 3rd day after the filing, the day when the mechanism's response arrived through the integration program's formal channel. She was in the chair that was positioned for looking at the same thing, and she was looking at him, which was not the same thing, and she received the outcome with the ears in the arriving position and the luminescence that was the distress opposite. The quarterly review, she said. Yes, he said. The assignment continues under the standard provisions. The oversight mechanism determined the professional practice had not been compromised. The committee's response to the report, she said. Positive, he said. The environmental complexity framing was received as a significant finding. The methodology adjustment and the timeline revision are authorized. The research team's expansion is approved. She was quiet with this in the way of someone receiving the confirmation of something they had built accurately. The additional environmental modeling specialist, she said. The search and the onboarding timeline. Several months, he said. Yes, she said, several months. She looked at him steadily. The integration specialist's continuity during that period is professionally appropriate. The oversight mechanism confirmed this, he said. I know, she said. I read the assessment's language carefully. She looked at him. Cale, he looked at her. The corridor, she said. You didn't have to stop. The distress markers were clear, he said. I know, she said. Most people in the corridor with the distress markers would have said something appropriate and continued to their office. She looked at him with the ears in the fully arriving position. You stopped. And then you said, come to the office, tell me the specific asymmetry. He looked at her. The specific asymmetry was what the situation required, he said. The distress was produced by the finding, and the finding was what was addressable. The addressable thing was the correct thing to address. Yes, she said, it was a pause that had the quality of something being said alongside the thing being said. You addressed it. The distance was not addressing it, he said. The corridor was. She looked at him. The notation column, she said. You said you needed to add entries. Yes, he said. More than 22. Significantly more, he said. The notation column has no entry limit, she said. No, he said. It doesn't. She stood from the chair. She moved toward the office exit with the quality of someone who was going somewhere rather than leaving somewhere. She stopped at the exit. Tomorrow morning, she said. The laboratory. The Eastern Sensor Array for the new methodology's first calibration session. Early, he said. The morning profile data requires it, she said. What time? She told him. He noted it. The morning profile, he said. The bioelectric patterns the previous methodology wasn't capturing. Yes, she said. The new framework needs to begin with them. She looked at him from the exit. The 22 observations, she said. The notation column. Yes, he said, the ears in the arriving position, the luminescence that was not distress. Good night, Cale, she said. Good night, he said. She left. He looked at the office, the walls, the research, the notation system, the 2 chairs. He opened the tablet. He created a new entry in the monitoring records notation column in the field for significant integration developments, and he wrote it with the accuracy he brought to all significant documentation. He read it once. He closed the tablet. He looked at the notation for tomorrow morning, the laboratory, the Eastern Sensor Array, the early hour, the morning profile that the new methodology required. 24 months, she had said. What the accurate methodology required. He was a cultural integration specialist. He documented what was actually there rather than what the documentation was supposed to contain. He had been doing this for 7 years and had, in 7 years, learned that the most significant findings were usually in the gaps. The notation column entries that were missing, the distance that was managed rather than addressed, the corridor that had been routed around for 3 weeks until it wasn't. The morning profile began early. He was thorough about beginnings, he always had been.